The truth behind the 20 kingdoms, the ancient kingdom, and the meaning of the D. What if the key to finding out the answers to all of these great mysteries of One Piece are already available to us? What if I told you it's as easy as understanding our real-world history? Well, welcome to the Mega Theory. We're going to figure everything out. Hello, Manakmantachi, this is JoyGirl, and you may or may not know that I am a bit of a history nerd. And if you didn't know, well, now you do. But I guess something more obvious is that I'm also a big One Piece nerd. Hence why I dedicate the majority of my spare time discussing One Piece with fellow One Piece fans. But what happens when you cross between a history nerd and a One Piece nerd? A banging theory. And this is a big one, so take a deep breath, make yourself comfortable, and prepare to have your mind blown. Because today we're attempting to solve the identity of the Gorosei, Imu, and the rest of the 20 kingdoms, as well as the events of the Void Century. And where do we begin? Well, how about 800 years ago? 800 years ago, 20 kingdoms from all over the world banded together to establish one great power. A power that would continue to this day as the world government, the rulers of the world. The descendants of these 20 kingdoms would come to be known as the Celestial Dragons, holding almost godlike status, essentially free to do anything they please, so long as it doesn't involve harming other members of this esteemed class. And while for a long time, the names of these 20 kingdoms were shrouded in mystery, as of the Egghead Island arc, we've been finding out more and more information about these monarchs, including the names of some of these dynasties. And based on these lore reveals, something that I have gathered, or more accurately, something that has become even more obvious to me, is that Oda-san is also quite the history nerd himself, which granted is something that has been apparent throughout the series, as we've seen on multiple occasions that Oda takes inspiration from a lot of real-life events, figures, and places to craft his own brilliant story. But it's become even more obvious as we find out more about the ancient kingdom and the 20 opposing kingdoms that caused its downfall. And the first piece of historical connection that I want to establish is that the events surrounding the ancient kingdom seem to have been heavily influenced by a period of real-world history known as classical antiquity. This term refers to the long history spanning from 8th century BC to 5th century AD, primarily referring to the apex of ancient civilizations like ancient Greece and ancient Rome. And this is all very similar to what we know about the history of the One Piece world, because we know that between around 1100 years ago to 800 years ago, there were great civilizations in the One Piece world that were thriving. This is clear from Shandora, the city of gold, which we know to have prospered in the year 402, which was over 1120 years ago, as well as the great ancient kingdom which flourished before the events of the Void Century up until roughly 900 years ago. And the influence of Greco-Roman culture is also evident with the names of the ancient weapons, Pluton, Poseidon, and Uranus, all being named after Greco-Roman deities. Recently, we also found out that the ancient kingdom was actually a very technologically advanced kingdom, far more superior than the technology currently available in present-day One Piece, and even more superior than the renowned genius Dr. Vegapunk himself. Its knowledge and advancements quashed during the Void Century, supposedly by the world government. And again, this is very similar to ancient Greece and ancient Rome, which amongst other things is widely recognized for its contributions to science and innovation, because we humans still have the classical age to thank for roads, central heating, and flushing toilets. But then, so what? It's not the first time Oda has drawn from real life, and I'm sure it won't be the last. But what if we dig deeper? And I mean much, much deeper, all the way to the beginning of the Roman Empire. And similar to how after the fall of the Roman Empire, the majority of the European world sunk into a period known as the Dark Ages, where all of the great knowledge and advancements of the previous period were lost to society, it seems the world government government have intentionally hid the secrets and the advancements and all the knowledge of the ancient kingdom from society, plunging them into a very dark age. According to Roman mythology, the story of two twin brothers, Romulus and Remus, tells us the story of how the Roman kingdom was born. Romulus and Remus are said to be two brothers who not only had family ties to the former king of an ancient Latin city, but was also born to a Vestal virgin, their father being Mars, the god of war. However, when their grand uncle deposed their former king, their grandfather, this new king viewed them as threats, ordering the brothers to be killed. But Romulus and Remus were saved by the river god, growing up to be natural leaders, unaware of their true lineage. They would eventually go on to find out about their heritage, setting off to build a city of their own, until the brothers themselves got into a dispute. A dispute about which hill they should build their new city on, a dispute that ultimately resulted in Romulus killing his own brother Remus, going on to found the city of Rome alone. Romulus would then expand the city into nearby Etruscan and Greek territories, but this new city faced a problem. Rome didn't have enough civilians, so Romulus invited men of all classes and backgrounds to come to Rome to become citizens. He accepted fugitives and slaves and freemen. This ragtag group meant that to nearby cities, the citizens of Rome seemed like ruffians. And right about now, my head's thinking, a new city whose founder is regarded to have the blood of the gods opened its doors to all sorts of people regardless of their background. Could it be that this is the story of the birth of the ancient kingdom, founded by the original Joy Boy who indeed has deity status by the sun god Nika, and how this kingdom accepted all races, all people, including ruffians like pirates, and therefore not desirable to the outside world. But wait, because it gets better. Because it's important to note that Rome was far from a haven. Romulus was a man who killed his own brother, and though we have to regard him in consideration of the context of his time, a very bloody, violent era, the Roman kingdom, and what eventually became the Roman Empire, was very different to, say, the ancient Greek society. Whereas Athenian democracy in ancient Greece truly meant that all men had the right to vote and participate in politics, the Roman Republic was limited to wealthy and influential families. And then it eventually turned into an empire, ruled by a single dictator or emperor. And I think the difference between these two approaches to government is actually very important, because Oda was clearly inspired by both ancient Greece and ancient Rome, hence the Greco-Roman names for the ancient weapons. And in that way, I think these two different cultures and approaches to power may be very representative of an element that exists in One Piece. The two different kinds of individuals with the will of D. The D family or the D clan is a big mystery in One Piece, especially because of those who bear the D initial, there are almost two directly opposing ideologies or two camps that exist. Those who, like Luffy, seek adventure and freedom for more wholesome reasons, and those like Blackbeard who seem to have a Machiavellian approach to life. Well, what if this was taken from the contrast between ancient Greece and ancient Rome? Both cities, both kingdoms legendary in their own rights, but ancient Rome representing the darker, the more violent and more sinister of the two. And what if I told you that this period of history could even reveal what the D initial means? Because in ancient Rome, a key principle that all Roman men lived by was that of dignitas. Dignitas, not to be confused or simply understood as dignity, because this word is one that cannot be easily translated into English. Dignitas was a concept that signified one's standing or rank in community, and the influence that one acquired throughout his life. It encapsulated reputation, achievements, self-worth, pride, honor, and even ethical standards. And I think that this perfectly captures what the Will of D means. Those with the Will of D all lead or all led legendary lives in their own ways. Those with the Will of D embody great dignitas. This is clear through their achievements, their reputation, their honor, and or values. This is the reason why the D bearers are said to bring about a storm, because to live according to a life of dignitas necessitates you to exemplify valor and strong will, lives that will indeed cause great flurry. Perhaps that's also the reason why those with the D initial all die with that same wide D-shaped smile. Even at their final moments, they know that they lived according to their principles and values, that they led satisfactory lives, that they achieved dignitas. This obtainment of dignitas marked on their faces even at their deaths for everyone to witness. But in ancient Roman society, to gain dignitas, you needed to win glorias, or glory. And in that ancient society, glory most often came in the form of military wins. The Roman Empire existed for 450 years, and during this long period, it was almost always at war. The Roman Empire had one of the most militaristic campaigns in all of human history, and this meant that Rome continued to expand, swallowing up other kingdoms near and far. At its peak, it spanned 3 continents, including most of Europe, Northern Africa, and Southwest Asia. But throughout its long history and struggle for expansion, it experienced a constant shift in allies and enemies. And I think this is where things get really interesting, because I think this explains the downfall of the ancient kingdom and the subsequent rise of the 20 kingdoms. Because something I failed to mention explicitly so far is that the Roman Empire was not always an empire. For a decent period, it was the Roman Republic, and rather than having one ruler, it was ruled by a senate. Actually, Rome was very averse to the idea of having one dictator and cherished this political system, which is why when Julius Caesar, a renowned statesman and general at the height of his career, made a move to transform the Roman Republic into an empire ruled by him as dictator. And when this happened, the other senators did not take kindly, killing Caesar before he could even see his dreams come true. But despite the senators' efforts, Rome turned into an empire anyways. But what I really find intriguing about this piece of history is the idea of having no one king, because that's a very familiar concept for us One Piece fans, a concept that is symbolically established through the empty throne, and the greater, darker, iconic truth that actually the One Piece world is ruled by one dictator after all, which has got me thinking whether the fall of Joy Boy and the Ancient Kingdom is influenced by the murder of Caesar and the ensuing line of dictators this resulted in. For example, what if, as the Ancient Kingdom grew and grew and grew, Joy Boy rose as its natural leader? Now, whether Joy Boy himself strove to rule as a dictator like Caesar, or whether the citizens of the Ancient Kingdom just gravitated towards him instead. Either way, what if this is what kicked off the Great War between the Ancient Kingdom and the 20 Kingdoms? If the Ancient Kingdom really is primarily based on ancient Rome, then it's easy to see that the 20 Kingdoms would most likely be the smaller or weaker kingdoms that Rome swallowed up in its insatiable hunger for conquest, or otherwise neighboring states that were threatened by the Ancient Kingdom's power and influence. So when it seemed that Joy Boy would become the ultimate ruler, causing some discord and stabilizing the harmony of the status quo, that's when the 20 Kingdoms banded together and seized the opportunity, starting a war that would result in the demise of the once great kingdom. And this seems even more plausible when we start scratching the surface of of each of the known 20 kingdoms. But before we move on to this next part of the theory, if you like what we've discussed so far, then please do subscribe. This will help me achieve my own dignitas so that I can leave with a great smile on my face. Okay, but going back to the video, and let me explain. We'll start by looking at who seems to currently be at the head of the 20 monarchs, the Nerona family. In chapters 1085 to 1086, it was heavily suggested via Cobra and Ivankov that Imu is actually Saint Imu of the Nerona family, the Nerona family being one of the first 20 kingdoms opposed by the world government. And this name Nerona is more than likely to be significant. Upon first glance, the most obvious historical influences seems to be Emperor Nero, a Roman empire notorious for debauchery and cruelty, said to have killed his own mother, and speculated to have started the Great Fire of Rome, blaming Christians instead, starting the persecution of this new religion. And the similarities are quite plausible. The famous Polish painting, Pochodni Nerona, or in English, Nero's Torches, depicts a scene of Christian martyrs who face execution due to being blamed for the Great Fire while the Emperor Nero watches overhead. And we have recently seen Imu to be a similarly callous and ruthless leader, wiping out an entire island and its people essentially on a whim. So it is entirely possible that the historical figure who inspired Oda's creation of Imu is none other than the Roman emperor who, throughout history, has become synonymous with evil, but I do think that there may be a further influence. Because although there is a direct connection between Imu's family name and that painting Nero's Torches, which again in Polish, Nero is Nerona, which is one of the immediate things that actually came to my mind when we were introduced to Imu's full name was the city of Verona. Because switch out one letter from Nerona, in fact just strike out one line in the letter N and you get Verona. And Verona is a city in a modern day Italy located as part of the Veneto region. The city is perhaps most well known as the city where William Shakespeare's famous play Romeo and Juliet is set. And I do think Nerona may also be a reference to this Italian region. Because apart from Verona, Veneto is also the home of another influential city, Venice. And well, Venice has a very interesting history. Because although it will be a much smaller city now, emerging as the city-state in the 9th century, Venice comprised much more territory and was actually known as the Republic of Venice. And the Republic of Venice also covered areas that we now know to be Verona. And this city-state, which Verona is a part of, is well known for having been a major financial and maritime power during the Middle Ages and the Renaissance. Which is to say that following the fall of the Roman Empire and the Age of Antiquity, Venice consolidated power. Shall we say, eerily similar to how Imu seems to have gained absolute world power following the events of the Void Century and the fall of the Ancient Kingdom. The city of Venice also became the staging area for the Crusaders, a religious holy war between the Catholic Church and Islam. And interestingly enough, we have discussed in the past how Imu and the world government seem to represent the Catholic Church, because the parallels between the world government and the early Catholic Church are very clear within the series, both being the authorized institutions at the top of their respective worlds, as well as Oda's aesthetic choices in his design of the world government. For example, the architecture of Marijois' Pangaea Castle closely resembles the Vatican Palace, and the empty throne is shaped like St. Peter's Square. And I have discussed the significance of this in greater detail in another video, so please feel free to go and watch that video because I discuss a lot of other historical connections that are still relevant. But for the purposes of this video, it's interesting that the city-state that Verona was a part of was the gathering point for Crusaders, similar to how Imu is the central figure whose decision the Gorosei wait on to engage in destruction. It's also interesting that just how despite the senators killing Caesar because they wanted to uphold the Roman Republic, Rome's history from that point forth was marked by dictators and emperors, and it seems like we have a similar case in One Piece. If there was an uprising to stop Joy Boy from being the ultimate ruler, in a sense of twisted irony, Imu became the world's dictator instead. Or how how about another of the 20 monarchs? A family I find particularly interesting is that of the Nefertari kingdom. We know that despite Queen Lily being originally scheduled to join the rest of the 20 kingdoms up at Marajwa, she chose not to go for unknown reasons. Instead, she set into motion a series of events that led to the spread of the poneglyphs and the passing down of the D initial down the Nefertari family line before mysteriously disappearing. Well, the observation that the Nefertari family and Arabasta in general seems to be based on the real-life ancient Egypt is nothing new. But it does get very interesting when we think about the relationship between ancient Egypt and ancient Greece and Rome, a relationship that goes back even before the birth of the Roman Empire. And if I was to do it justice, I could spend the entire video recounting the history of Greco-Egyptian Roman history, but the short and sweet version is this. Following the death of Alexander the Great, his massive Greek empire was parceled off by various successors who couldn't agree on who should be the next king. So from 300 to 30 BC, Egypt became the Ptolemaic Kingdom or the Ptolemaic Egypt, referring to a lineage of Greek monarchs who ruled Egypt, assimilating into Egyptian culture to acquire the trust and loyalty of its citizens, while also ensuring the continuance of their own Greek heritage. From the mid-3rd century BC, Ptolemaic Egypt was the wealthiest and most powerful of Alexander's successor states, and it was the leading example of Greek civilization. However, this power and influence gradually began to weaken, coinciding with the rise of the Roman Empire, until it lost to Roman conquest. And interesting enough, the ruler at the time and the last of the Ptolemaic pharaohs was Cleopatra. What's even more interesting is that Cleopatra and Julius Caesar were partners in love and politics. And come on, I'm not the only one thinking, Joy Boy and Lily? It's true that Nefertari is the name of an Egyptian queen who existed way before the times of Cleopatra, but Nefertari is just a family name to establish the Egyptian influence of the Arabasta kingdom, whereas Lily herself, she seems to be based on the last Egyptian pharaoh, a smart and devious woman who understood politics and played her cards. Although not very well, because following Caesar's death, she also died, committing suicide when it became clear that she would not survive. But this does seem to fit what we know about Lily. The Nefertari family was a part of the 20 kingdoms, but was also somehow loyal to Joy Boy and the ancient kingdom. Lily played the politics, and then eventually she disappeared. Perhaps as a kingdom that had been previously disgruntled by the ancient kingdom's rise to power, when it came to Lily's reign, she was a lot more politically savvy and strategic, or maybe it was a matter of the heart. Either way, she and Joy Boy came to be on good terms, but because of politics, she had to side with the 20 kingdoms until she could make her ultimate move. But this would mean that Joy Boy is based on Julius Caesar, and I think it's about time to consider what this would actually mean in detail. Because although Caesar was martyred by the public following his death, Julius Caesar could also be viewed as a ruthless dictator, a tyrant, bullying his way into becoming the Roman emperor. Whereas it's also true that some say that he was actually quite merciful, offering those he conquered Roman citizenship. And I think this dual face of Caesar is actually very fitting with a piece of dialogue that has always stuck with me. Rayleigh's words to the Straw Hats, that when the Straw Hats find out the truth, they may draw their own conclusions, have their own opinion, their own perspective. One of the first details we found out about the Void Century, that things are not so clear-cut. It's possible to have more than one view. And so maybe what this means is that Joy Boy or the Ancient Kingdom weren't wholly good or pure, which is something we've seen throughout One Piece, that no one is truly 100% good or bad. And then when you also throw in the fact that both ancient Greece and Rome are relevant, or were relevant in inspiring Oda, then you could even suppose that there was a legitimate reason to quell the Ancient Kingdom if Greece and Rome are supposed to represent the two type of D family members, some of the Ancient Kingdom being more aggressive than the others, and overall this this causing a lot of hatred and distrust by the surrounding kingdoms. So if we keep looking into the other monarchs that then opposed the ancient kingdom, then the first of the 20 families' names we were introduced to in the series is Don Quixote. And it's also well known that the Don Quixote family and Dressrosa more broadly is heavily influenced by Spain. Well, it just so happens that Hispania was the name used for the Iberian Peninsula that fell under Roman rule from the 2nd century BC. From this point forth, their population was gradually Romanized, thereby supporting my point earlier that each of the 20 monarchs seemed to be territories that the ancient kingdom took over or otherwise encroached upon. Similarly, the Figuelands. As one of the most recently revealed names, there's not a whole lot of information we can draw from to definitively claim that the Figuelands are connected to a real-life historical kingdom, but my money is on Sparta. We know that Figueland Garling is the head of the Holy Knights. He's an extremely proficient combatant, and well, it just so happens that Sparta, one of the ancient Greek city-states, is characterized by its highly militaristic structure. Spartan culture centered around the military, with young boys starting training when they were just 7 years old. On top of physical strength and toughness, Spartans were also trained to uphold the importance of the Spartan state, this nationalistic pride being a core value. And this seems to very much fit what we've seen of Figueland Garling, who values structure and hierarchy. His ruthlessness in doing away with Mjolsgard shows how rigid his way of thinking is. And best of all, there is a strong relationship between Sparta and Figs. Figs seemingly being the most important part of the Figueland name. Although figs were popular in ancient Greece most generally, we also know that it was special for Spartans particularly. Early figs were used as training fuel for Olympic athletes, as well as given as medals to the winners. Figs were also central to the Spartan diet, it being one of Sparta's main agricultural produce. And again, this is important when you consider that Sparta also eventually fell to Rome, suggesting that maybe the Figuelands were another one of the kingdoms that were conquered by the ancient kingdom, and then it would make sense that the Figuelands would then join the 20 kingdoms to overthrow the ancient kingdom, especially as a proud and headstrong people. A family name that I really struggled to find a real-life connection to, the classical age in particular, was the Manmayer family. The name really just doesn't ring a bell when it comes to real-life history, and we also don't know all that much about the Manmayer family to try and find similarities according to any special characteristics. I will say that the first thing that came to my mind when I heard Manmayer was Myanmar. But Myanmar is a modern name for the country of Burma, and although the Roman Empire expanded to great lengths, I'm not aware that they made it all the way to Southeast Asia. However, for whatever reason, if Myanmar is somehow relevant, I do think that something that is interesting is that the former state councillor of Myanmar, which is the equivalent of a prime minister, Aung San Suu Kyi, was a Nobel Prize winner for having championed democracy in a politically fraught state. However, in more recent times, Kyi has been criticized for defending the state's use of armed forces to commit genocide against religious minorities. And in terms of relevance for One Piece, even if this doesn't relate to the theory about the ancient age and the classical period, it does fit with that same idea of political figures initially thought to be doing good, only to be corrupted, similar to Imu's possession of the throne. And this actually seems to be even clearer when it comes to the Gorosei's historical counterparts. But firstly, when it comes to the Gorosei, what's really interesting is that each of the Gorosei is obviously named after one of the planets, but in particular, their names have Greco-Roman influence, each being named after a Greco-Roman deity. But why? Because the ancient kingdom is supposed to be the representation of ancient Greece or Rome. Well, I actually think that the Gorosei's names highlights the Byzantine Empire. The Byzantine Empire, also known as the Eastern Roman Empire, was the continuation of the Roman Empire in the eastern states. The Byzantine Empire actually survived for a long time, all the way until 1453 actually, when it finally succumbed to the rise of the Ottoman Empire. The Byzantines Byzantines actually considered themselves Romans, and the name Byzantine wasn't used to describe the empire until after their demise. They were also very Christian, this being their defining trait, and it held order and traditional hierarchies as key values. And I think you can clearly see the relevance to the Gorosei. Via their Greco-Roman names, it's as if they're trying to emulate and continue the strength of the ancient kingdom. If we said that the 20 kingdoms were once conquered by the ancient kingdom, once the ancient kingdom was overthrown, it's as if the world government tried to keep on to that same glory and legacy of such a great kingdom, therefore continuing the influence as shown through the Gorosei's names. In addition, going back to my point about the world government being heavily influenced by Catholicism, it can't be a coincidence that the Byzantine society was also a very religious society. The Byzantines were also a highly stratified society with clear demarcations between their wealthy and poor social classes, which is very evident amongst the celestial dragons generally. But we've also seen more recently that the Gorosei are particularly dismissive of humans, regarding them as insects not worthy of any consideration. And something else that's interesting, however, is that the appearance of each of the Gorosei seem to be inspired by key figures in politics. It's been pointed out that Saturn looks like Karl Marx, for example, Venus Judo like Gandhi, Mercury like Mikhail Gorbachev, Jupiter looks like Abraham Lincoln, and Mars looks like Itagaki Taisuke. And I'm not going to get into the politics of each and every person because many of these figures were actually active in relatively recent times. But all I'm going to say is that for various reasons, each of these figures are very grey personas. On the surface, it seems like they're all liberators, but when you look into their personal histories, or when you look at what their ideals and efforts resulted in, even if those results weren't necessarily in accordance with their intentions, they are all figures that support that notion that no one is solely good or bad, or even the notion that well-intentioned figures are corruptible, similar to what we discussed about Aung San Suu Kyi. And when it comes to One Piece, again, it seems to support the idea that although the 20 kingdoms in some way, at some point, may have thought they were doing some good or doing something legitimate and necessary, it's apparent that that wasn't the result. The overthrow of the ancient kingdom resulted in another dictator in the form of Imu. Now, those are all the known names of the 20 kingdoms, but based on all of this, we can start speculating that Oda might continue this theme and base some of the other families on real-life countries that were conquered by the Romans, like Britannia or the Celtic people of Gaul. Or you could even analyze this history to consider other events that Oda may appropriate for his story. For example, we know that Julius Caesar and Cleopatra had a son. Could it be that we'll also find out about an offspring between Joy Boy and Lily? And I could keep speculating, but I think I will now leave that to you. So let me know what you think. Does this theory have any ground? Do you have any hypotheses about the Void Century based on real life history? Let me know by leaving a comment below. Don't forget to like, and please do subscribe to this channel if you found today's discussion interesting. I promise to provide more thrilling One Piece discussions to stimulate your minds. Thank you to all of our patrons and channel members for your continued support. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon. So it's really dawned on me that Norse mythology is going to be a lot more important to the series than I may have realized, especially since the confirmation of the existence of Yggdrasil in Elbaf since chapter 1127, what with Yggdrasil being a very central element within Norse mythology. Oda seems to be leaning in quite hard into the Nordic culture and Nordic cosmology, naming characters and elements within his series and within the Elbaf arc directly after things that actually exist in Norse mythology. And to be fair, this isn't really all that surprising. We've known of Prince Loki for quite some time now, who's also a very important figure within the Norse pantheon. And so we have all been long aware, or we've long assumed, that Elbaf will be heavily influenced by Nordic culture. But it really got me thinking, just how much do I really know, or do you really know about Norse mythology? And just how much will not only Elbaf, but the entire series be related to this ancient culture and this ancient tradition. For example, will Yggdrasil reveal the existence of different types of giants within the series? Will we find out that Elbaf consists of 9 different regions, sort of similar to Wano Kuni? Could the Yggdrasil be the source of devil fruits? Could it be the source of life itself? So naturally, this got me really into researching Norse mythology. And I just want to discuss some of the things I came across which I think may be relevant to the series. And I'm not gonna lie, I think I got in a little too deep. Like, I'm talking listening to podcasts debating the accuracy of the very source material that has been the basis of our modern understanding of Norse mythology. I've been looking into the Christianization of Norse cosmology, how other religions than the original pagan religion has bled into influencing the traditional Nordic folklore. And although I doubt that Oda has dove this deep into the rabbit hole, we do know that Oda definitely does his research. He takes inspiration from some of the most obscure folklore from various cultures, including for some of his very, very important, very major character and plot developments. I'm looking at you, Joy Boy. So I definitely think that having some knowledge of Nordic folklore, of Nordic cosmology, is going to be very helpful for us, not only in understanding Elbaf, but possibly beyond, especially as we delve deeper and deeper into the final saga, which is obviously going to deliver more and more in terms of lore about the One Piece world and the One Piece history and the One Piece universe. So, let's dive right into it. But before we do, friendly reminder to please subscribe if you're not already. It is September and I would really love your help to get to 100k subscribers. If you're already subscribed, great. Now you can like and comment on the video instead. Okay, now I'm not going to go into the whole history of Nordic cosmology, but it's important to note that most of our modern day understanding of Norse mythology comes from written sources that were recorded around the 13th century, namely the Prose Edda and the Poetic Edda, written by an Icelandic historian and scholar named Snorri Sturluson. Whereas traditional Nordic mythology is estimated to have been developed much earlier, anywhere from 500 to 800 BCE, which is over 2,000 to 3,000 years ago during the Iron Age. Meaning that what we understand about Norse mythology is likely to differ from what was originally developed or what was originally believed millennia ago, as it was originally an oral tradition. And so accounts and traditions, accounts and beliefs may differ from regions and between generations, which is a fascinating history and I highly recommend you to all look into it. But for the purposes of our discussion, and in relation to One Piece, what is important is that these written records, even if they're not 100% accurate to the original beliefs, it's likely that these records reflect the beliefs that were held by the people around that time. And given that the Viking Age is around the 9th to the 11th century, it's more likely that these written records reflect the beliefs that were held by the Vikings, because that's much closer in age or much closer in history. And that's important to us because Oda has been very heavily inspired by Vikings, not only in creating the Elbafian giants, but I would argue beyond. Vikings or Viking influence has been long apparent throughout the serialization of the series, even aside from the Elbafian giants who were introduced quite early in the series in the Little Garden arc. Even earlier than that, in his post-chapter notes for chapter 10, Oda already expressed his interest in Vikings, calling them one of his favorite kinds of pirates. At another point, a few chapters later, Oda goes as far as to say that his childhood enjoyment of an animated TV series called Little Viking Vicky, he explicitly says that this is probably what began his interest in pirates in the first place. And so although there are obviously lots of different inspirations, lots of influences that has resulted in the creation of the greatest series known to humankind, Vikings as an early form of seafaring adventures, earlier form of pirates, that has been a major source of inspiration for Oda. You know, fans have long pointed out the similarities between the god Tyr and the wolf beast Fenrir who bites off Tyr's arm, and its similarities to Shanks and the Sea King who eats Shanks's arm. And that is obviously a major moment for the series, a major moment that is established as early as chapter 1. And the Tyr and Shanks connection is actually one that I have discussed at length in another video. If you're not really familiar with that Norse mythology, I highly recommend you to go watch that video. You know what, I'll probably end up naming quite a few of previous videos, so I'll list them all below. And obviously, since Shanks, we have seen other lots of influences: Dorian Brogy, the new warrior giants, Elbaf, and of course Prince Loki, which, as I said, Oda has directly taken that name off an existing character or existing figure. But we're getting a bit ahead of ourselves, so let me start from the beginning. Norse mythology, also sometimes known as Scandinavian mythology, refers to the stories and beliefs of ancient North Germanic people. It starts off with a being called Ymir, a primordial giant, meaning that Ymir was the first or the earliest known giant, and Ymir is attributed to being the creator of all giants, or according to its Nordic name, the Jotnar, or the Jotun. Ymir is said to be evil and to represent chaos, his own unsettling birth, as well as his unexplainable creation of giants and of other creatures who somehow appeared from his body. This reflects the primal and the untamed chaos of the natural world. He was killed by gods, including Odin, who is also known as the All-Father, as having supremacy over all the Aesir gods, and following Ymir's death, Odin and the other gods used up all of his body to create the universe. For example, his brains formed the clouds and his bloods created the seas and so on and so forth. And because of this, because of his fundamental role within the creation story, Ymir has come to represent not only chaos, but the transition from chaos to order. The idea that the god supposedly used his evil body to bring structure and order into the world. The most obvious connection that I was reminded of when I first read or heard about Ymir was Imu. For one, I think even their names sound somewhat similar, but probably more importantly is the fact that Imu is the head of the world government, and so in that sense you could say that Imu is a figure who has transitioned the world, who has taken the world from the chaos of the Void Century War era to the current world that exists today, which is very ordered, very structured. He brought order into the world. He's the head of the world government, which sets the rules, sets order. And yet at the same time, Imu can also represent an unsettling and evil force, given Imu is a major antagonist within the series. And now you might point out to me like, hang on, wait a second, that doesn't really make sense. If Ymir is the ancestor of all the Jotnar, of all the Jotuns, aka giants, then this would mean that Imu should represent the forefather or the creator of all the Elbathians, potentially all the giants that we're going to get in the series. And I just don't think it's quite that simple, primarily because at the end of the day, as much as Oda may have been inspired by Norse mythology, it's highly unlikely that he has taken it literally or word for word or one for one. This is always the case with Oda. He weaves in real life stories or weaves in real life myths, and he does so in such a way where it fits his story rather than trying to just make his work, make his series a replica or a retelling of a pre-existing material. So as always, I think that's important to remember, not just for the rest of this discussion, but any future discussions we may have about history and the mythological inspirations that Oda has drawn from. But also, it's not that simple, because the giant race, or the Jotun, and all the races that exist in Norse mythology is a lot more complex than that. So this brings us to our second very important element. Aside from Ymir, another very important element to the Norse mythology, to Norse cosmology, is the existence of Yggdrasil, also known as the World Tree. Norse mythology is based in a universe that is made up of 9 realms, and each of these realms are connected to Yggdrasil, hence why it's called the World Tree. And these 9 realms are divided for various species species and beings who live in each of the realms. For example, the Aesir gods, they're the primary gods that exist in the universe. They live in Asgard. We've got humans who live in Midgard. We've got the Jotun, who are the giants. We've got different types of elves, dwarves, and so on and so forth. And I'll get to looking at the races or the species in a second, but here we have to pause because obviously Yggdrasil is now a confirmed part of One Piece itself. So we've all suspected that that large tree that we've seen in Big Mom's flashback was going to be a representation of Yggdrasil. I don't know if I was quite expecting Oda to go directly or go explicitly name it Yggdrasil, but as of chapter 1127, Yggdrasil is a One Piece canon. As to how we can apply the existence of Yggdrasil into One Piece, there are lots of ways I think we could choose to interpret this. First is that Yggdrasil and the 9 realms that exist in Norse mythology may represent Elbaf, and Elbaf having 9 different regions. You know, each section, each region could have its own culture and weather and geographical features, you know, very similar to what we saw in Wano. For example, the Legoland that we've seen since chapter 1126, that might just be a characteristic of one of these 9 realms. Alternatively, the 9 realms could depict the different races that exist in One Piece, which is a bit tricky to explain because admittedly there are more than 9 races in One Piece, but this could be explained in a certain way where certain races are just offshoots of a primary 9 species types. What I'm trying to say is there could have been originally 9 races, and then throughout time and throughout evolution, we've resulted in the number of species and the number of races that exist today. For example, the Lunarians, they might be a particular giant race. The Buccaneers, we know them to have descended or to be somehow related to the giant race. Actually, going back to the Lunarians, they may actually even be a particular type of Jotnar that exists in Norse mythology, because there is something called the fire giants, and I think fire giants is something that is actually quite fitting for the Lunarians. But anyways, here's something about the Jotnar or the giants. According to Norse mythology, the Jotnar are often regarded as evil, whereas the Aesir, which I mentioned earlier, are known to be the gods. But the relationship between the Jotnar and the Aesir gods is very complicated. Even though these two groups are often seen to be at war, they're often in conflict, they also often have relations with each other. The greatest example is probably Thor, which is one of the major gods within Norse mythology. Despite being one of the Aesir gods, Thor was actually also part Jotun because of his mother and his grandmother. Or even Loki. Loki, also considered part of the Aesir gods, is actually a Jotun by birth, meaning that this status of Jotun or Aesir god can sometimes change. Sometimes people or sometimes beings may be accepted into godhood. And how this relates to One Piece is that for all intents and purposes, it seems like the Elbathian giants are supposed to represent the Jotnar, primarily because the Jotun, the Jotnar are now commonly known as giants, even though, fun fact, originally it might not have been that giants or Jotun was supposed to represent anything that is that large in stature. But anyways, especially given that Loki of Elbaf, Prince Loki of Elbaf, is most likely connected to the god Loki, who, as I said, is actually by birth a Jotun. And although the Jotun are considered evil in ancient Norse mythology, I think rather than focusing on this idea of evil, I think Oda may have just leaned into the idea of the Jotun being troublesome, of them being brash or violent. After all, Saul expresses disgust at the Elbathians. He doesn't want to be associated with them. I think that's because the Elbathians, similar to the Jotun, are supposed to be known as sort of these rougher, troublesome creatures. But also, what's interesting is that even in Norse mythology, there are different types of giants. Like I said earlier, there's the fire giants or there's the frost giants, and I think that might be the basis of why we have various different giant types within the One Piece universe. From appearance to personalities and cultures, the various giant species or the various giant races within the One Piece universe are shown to be very distinct, and so equally, the ancient giant race, they may represent the Jotun, which is also interesting because the name Ors, the name of the first ancient giant that we met at Thriller Bark. Ors is actually the name of one of the Norse gods, who according to some accounts is actually thought to be an incarnation of the All-Godfather, the All-Father Odin. Anyways, if we go back to Yggdrasil, aside from the 9 realms and their various inhabitants, there are 2 other creatures, very important creatures who reside at Yggdrasil. The first is a huge eagle that sits in its branches. The second is an evil dragon, an evil serpent that resides at the base. And the eagle and the dragon are said to be enemies, often at odds with each other. And I think this may also be very relevant for the One Piece universe, because the way that I've chosen to interpret this is that the serpent or the dragon that sits at the base is actually supposed to be represented by the celestial dragons, and the eagle is going to be represented by whatever comes out of that giant egg that we saw on Roger's ship. The one that has yet to be explained, but I'm going to guess that there is going to be some sort of relationship, and that's going to be quite important to the series. Something else that is very central to Norse mythology is the concept of time, and that's also quite heavily interrelated with the concept of fate. There are conflicting opinions about how time was understood according to Norse mythology, and I'm not here to tell you which one's correct or accurate, but I think what is relevant for today's discussion is that one popular interpretation, one popular account is the idea that the concept of time is cyclical. It's cyclical rather than linear. Time in Norse mythology represents natural cycles of life, death, and rebirth. But like I said, the concept of time is also heavily related to the concept of fate. Fate, also known as Verd in Norse mythology, is overseen by these 3 supernatural beings that reside in Yggdrasil, and these beings, they weave the destiny of all things. They control the past, present, and future, and you can't escape this destiny. If we translate this into the One Piece world, well, we already know that fate exists, and it's quite a prominent idea within the series. I'm sure people are going to be a little upset, or at the least apprehensive about the idea that everything's going to come down to fate and destiny, especially the idea of there being actual figures that control and weave everything that happens, because that would mean that there's no free will in the world. And then what would that say about Luffy as a character? Now, aside from clarifying that even within Norse cosmology, these beings that control fate, they don't determine absolutely everything. For example, sometimes they just determine when something will happen, as opposed to how something will happen. Sometimes they'll just say when someone is going to die. What that means is that that outcome, that death, is inescapable, but that doesn't necessarily limit free will, because the person can still act and can still respond in ways, but it just won't change the outcome. More importantly, as we have already established, Oda isn't going to take things word for word. He's going to find a way to make ideas work for his story, even if he's borrowing some of these ideas. Anyways, the notion of fate and destiny, as I said, it already exists in the series, so I don't think that should be very controversial. As for the cyclical nature of time, I've actually already theorized in the past that the entire world of One Piece, that this story and what's unfolding in front of us is part of a cycle. The main premise of this discussion that I made in the past was that the story of the Void Century is actually Luffy's story that is taking place in the current universe, or in the current timeline, meaning that the story of the past is actually also taking place in the present. This is why that final island is called Laugh Tale, because it's actually supposed to be Luffy's tale or Luffy's tale. And this can explain things like why Roger said he was too early, because obviously Luffy hadn't been born yet. And look, I've discussed this in greater detail in another video. Highly recommend you to watch that video. I will also post the link of that below. But even putting wild theories aside, the cyclical nature of time is also somewhat present, especially through recent developments or through recent reveals. One, we have the idea of Luffy as Joy Boy, as a reincarnation of Joy Boy, who's come back 800 years into the future. And Luffy, this reincarnation of Joy Boy, is also something that was prophesized. We also have the idea of an ancient civilization that is actually a lot more technologically advanced than the present. This idea of a great war that occurred 800 years ago, and yet Vegapunk also said that this war is not over and it's going to continue, it's going to reoccur in the future. Not to mention another huge development, that the world, the previous ancient civilization all sunk underwater, that the world that exists today is actually the rebirth of the former world. And then on top of this, we're going to witness another rebirth because the current world is also going to be no longer, because the current world will also sink again. So this idea of the cycle of past, present, future, how they're all interwoven, how it's a continuous circling story, that's, I think, quite present in One Piece today. And to better understand time, fate, and this concept of cycles, this is all very closely related to the idea or the concept and the prophesized event of Ragnarok. Ragnarok is another very, very important part of Norse mythology. In case you haven't heard of it already, it is the name of a major war that's going to happen between the Jotun and the gods. It's a war that hasn't happened yet, but it's prophesized will occur, and it's prophesized that this war is going to result in the death, the end of the world. It's going to result in the death of many high-profile gods, including Odin and Thor, and although it hasn't happened yet, it is commonly understood because it has been prophesized, it's going to happen. The outcome is inevitable. But it's also believed that this catastrophic world event is actually not just going to result in the death of the world, but the rebirth of the world. And this is an idea that I think we can safely assume that Oda has definitely been inspired by, especially for the upcoming Great War that's going to mark the final saga of One Piece. If Ragnarok is the final battle that will end the world or end the current world, it's a massive battle involving the gods, the giants, all these other monsters and creatures. It seems that it's very much going to be represented by this impending final war of One Piece that's, like Ragnarok, going to involve all these sorts of players, all these different groups and factions. Oda has mentioned in the past that this final war is going to make that mega war at Marineford look cute. But a very particularly interesting parallel is that it's actually said that at the end of Ragnarok, it was prophesied that the world is going to be submerged underwater. And now this has obviously also entered the One Piece canon. Even more interestingly, we know that this has already happened in the past because according to Vegapunk, the previous world sunk underwater by 200 meters, which again reflects that sort of cyclical idea that we were just discussing. And then Vegapunk said that this is likely to occur again. Past, present, future, life, death, rebirth, cycles. And just as Ragnarok is supposed to be a symbol of not just death, but rebirth, this idea of renewal, we're also very much expecting that Luffy is going to bring about a new dawn. He's going to bring about a new era following the death of this current world, following the final epic war of the series. What's really interesting about Ragnarok is that in Norse mythology, Loki plays a major role in the final battle. Loki is supposed to lead the Jotnar and he's supposed to lead the monsters into battle. These monstrous creatures who, by the way, he has 3 and they're actually his offspring, but Loki leads these giants and these monsters against the gods to fight the gods in Ragnarok. Now, we haven't yet made a direct connection between the Azir gods in Nordic mythology to any particular group or any particular series or faction in One Piece yet, but I guess in this scenario, this could really mean that Loki, Prince Loki of Elbaf, might play a major role in potentially leading the Elbathians, potentially other races such as those races that are related to giants like the Buccaneers, and Loki may be a central figure in leading all those people into war, into battle against the Celestial Dragons. In that case, Celestial Dragons being a representation of the Azir gods. Now, it's fun to think about Loki, especially in the wake of chapter 1127, where we were introduced to this shape-shifting, gigantic creature that wears a crown. Knowing the shape-shifting ability of the Nordic Loki, I immediately assumed that this creature in the Legoland castle, I thought that this may be actually Prince Loki. And especially given that Loki of Norse mythology is known to be a trickster, he's mischievous, he's a witty god. Perhaps for the purposes of One Piece, Oda has created a similarly playful, sort of naughty young prince in the form of Prince Loki, and what we've witnessed in chapter 1127, I assumed was a young Prince Loki, seeing as he is only 63 years old, which is relatively young when you consider the old age of giants. This is Loki just having fun, being a little mischievous. What's actually interesting is that Loki, Prince Loki of Elbaf, Prince Loki of the One Piece story, it actually is possible that that name might refer to a number of different figures that have similar names within Norse mythology. Another big example is Laufey. Laufey, which sounds very much like Loki, especially when you think about pronunciations in Nordic culture and ancient Norse. And then that obviously, however, makes you think about Luffy, because Laufey, Luffy, Luffy, Laufey. But actually, I think the more obvious connection, the more obvious character or being that we can connect to Luffy within Norse mythology, within the Norse pantheon, is actually a god, or I should say a goddess, called Sol, who is the goddess of sun, the sun goddess. In general, the sun is an important, very important element within Norse culture. Archaeologists have found various artifacts like sun wheels and solar symbols on their runes, and it's believed that Vikings and ancient Norsemen greatly revered the sun. Whereas for Sol, the goddess of sun, it was understood that Sol moves across the sky and therefore brings light into the world. And it was also believed that Sol was being constantly chased by this wolf named Skoll. And it was prophesied that during the Ragnarok, that wolf Skoll, would finally catch up to Sol, devouring the sun goddess, and therefore that would plunge the world into darkness. However, following Ragnarok, it was believed that Sol's daughter was going to take her place, and then that her daughter was going to bring light into the world following Ragnarok, this symbolizing renewal, rebirth, and continuity even in the face of destruction. And now this obviously makes you think about implications for Luffy and his fate by the end of the series. Is he gonna have a kid? No. The idea of Luffy dying before the end of One Piece, or at least even if he doesn't die, this idea that he's going to pass on his will to the new generation, these are ideas that have been discussed at length. They're somewhat popular ideas that exist already, but it also makes you wonder about the importance of the sun god to the Elbafians in general. We do know that they actually observe the solstice. We've seen this before. The solstice, which is very closely related to reverence of the sun. This sun god was also named again in chapter 1127, and it's yet to be confirmed whether this sun god, this idea of Sol, is related to their belief in Nika, because we at least know that they are aware of Nika as the sun god, which really makes you wonder what is Luffy's importance going to be within the Elbaf arc. If we think about other important figures within the Norse pantheon, one that really comes to mind for me is this idea of Idun, the goddess of spring, the goddess of rejuvenation. The reason why is because Idun is known to have a tree, and this tree fruits golden apples. Golden apples that gives gods the power of immortality. And upon learning about this, I immediately obviously wondered whether this relates to Imu, whether it relates to the immortality of Imu and the celestial dragons, which has yet to be explained, or whether it alternatively even has to do with the creation or the birth of devil fruits itself. Another important possible connection between the world of Norse mythology and the world of One Piece is this existence of the Helmagir. Helmagir, which is said to be a well that's the source of all rivers, and I think that may be the inspiration for the All Blue. Another important element is the existence of Bifrost. Bifrost is a bridge that connects different realms, the realms of Asgard and Midgard, the homes of the gods and humans respectively, and there are various ways to interpret how the Bifrost might be relevant to the world of One Piece, but the more prominent connections that I made was that the Bifrost could be represented by Tequila Wolf, or all the alcoholic wolves that exist, the bridges that exist in each of the blues, but it could also even represent the red line. But in saying that, the red line is probably more obviously connected with this idea of the Jormungandr being another very important part of Norse mythology. I've actually created an entire video about Jormungandr and the red line, so I'll post that link below as well. Highly recommend you go watch it. And look, there are just actually quite a lot of potential interpretations, possible connections, and inspirations that Oda may have taken from Norse mythology into the One Piece world. For example, I think I could have an idea as to where Oda is going with Zoro's missing eye, and I plan to discuss that in another video, so make sure to keep tuned. But let me know if you find these discussions interesting, if you like learning more about Norse mythology and how it could relate to the world of One Piece. Again, not just Elbaf, but for the One Piece universe at large, because I think Oda has been heavily influenced in creating One Piece as a whole, not just the Elbafian arc, although obviously it's going to be a prominent feature of the Elbafian arc. But in the interest of time, I am going to wrap it up here, but please let me know again if this is something that interests you. Let me know in the comments below if you know anything else about Norse mythology that I've missed, because I love reading more about it. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon. I think I figured out the meaning behind Zoro's left eye, and I want to talk about it. Ever since the time skip when Zoro reappeared with the scar over his left eye, this scar and his eye has been the source of many discussions and speculations. Does it hold some sort of special power or ability? You know, is he hiding some sort of Sharingan eye? Or is it simply a design choice? Well, I think I've uncovered a new layer of meaning behind this scar, and it's all thanks to Norse mythology. If you've been following my channel, you'll know that I have recently been really into Norse mythology, and I've dedicated an entire video discussing the many connections, the many connections that seem to exist between Norse folklore and One Piece, because in my opinion, not only will Nordic mythology be important to Elbaf, but I think it could tell us a whole lot more about the entire series of One Piece itself. So I do highly recommend you go watch that video if you haven't already. But as I teased in that discussion, there is one folktale or one element within Norse mythology that I didn't discuss in that video because I think it deserves its own discussion, and that is the Norse connection that may relate to our trusty Straw Hat Swordsman, Mr. Roronoa Zoro, and the mystery of his left eye. So we're going to discuss that today, but before we do, please make sure to subscribe to the channel. Zoro's left eye isn't the only mystery we're going to figure out today. We're also going to figure out why over 50% of you aren't subscribed to this channel. And if you are one of those who are not subscribed, then please do to help me get to 100k subscribers. That way we can finally get on with discussing Zoro. Okay, so let's get back to Zoro's eye. Like I said, there have been lots of discussions, lots of theories centering around this topic, and there have been for many years. While some fans have claimed that this is just a design choice, I think it is fair to assume that there is a greater significance, a greater meaning, or at least the story behind what happened to result in Zoro's scar. On the other hand, take a look at these concept designs that were published at the end of chapter 597, because looking at this, it seems like Oda may have always envisioned for Zoro to sport some sort of scar on his face following the time skip, but this scar wasn't necessarily always going to be over his eye, and it wasn't always going to be on the left side of his face either. In which case, looking at these concepts, you sort of do question whether this really was just simply a design choice and Oda just liked the idea of Zoro sporting some sort of scar on his face. I guess it could just be a simple mark that emphasizes what sort of grueling, heavy training that Zoro underwent during the time skip with Mihawk. But even if that was the original intention, even if Oda just simply liked the idea of symbolizing the time skip and that growth through a mark, I'm sure as Oda settled on the design, and I'm sure as he settled on the stories that he would devise for each of the Straw Hats, I think he would have also developed a more important story about how Zoro actually attained that scar over his left eye, especially because we know that scars often have a deeper significance in One Piece. This is something we've seen through very important characters throughout the entirety of the series. And for starters, I think the significance of scars in general general, or physical disfigurements, should I say. That seems to be an important idea that Oda has been greatly inspired by from Norse mythology. Because according to Norse beliefs, scars represent more than just a physical mark of injury. Or more so than scars itself, injuries and specifically missing limbs or missing body parts, physical disfigurements. This seems to be a very central idea within Norse mythology. Apparently, it represents this notion that individuals had to pay the highest price in order to achieve any unique duty or achievement. And it's said that those with marks of physical disfigurement or almost ritualistic mutilation, these markings seem to be symbols of a special destiny. That's why there's a running theme of significant figures across Norse mythology who each have lost a body part, each for very significant reasons, each disfigurement representing something very important. And this is obviously an idea that is very present in One Piece. We similarly have key characters with unique scars or missing limbs and other sorts of physical disfigurements, each scar or each disfigurement for very specific reasons. That's an idea that was presented to us from the very first chapter of the series with Shanks. So I think it can be said, I think it can be fairly assumed that Oda was very likely influenced by Norse tradition in implementing this within his series. And I think this may also apply in the case of Zoro's left eye. And the figure that I want to focus on, the one that I think has the clearest connection, will make the most sense in trying to understand the mystery of Zoro's left eye, that is none other than the All-Father of Norse mythology himself, the Aesir god Odin. So for those of you who don't know, Odin is the chief of the Aesir pantheon. That means he's the chief or the head of the Aesir gods, the Aesir gods being the main group of gods that exist in Norse mythology, so you can almost think of him as being like Zeus in Greek mythology. Odin was the god of war, and over time he also became associated with nobility and royalty, but Odin was also regarded as a god of knowledge. Many tales about Odin center around him going on different quests to acquire knowledge, most of these also involving him sacrificing himself to attain this sort of wisdom. In fact, one of the passages I came across whilst researching Odin was the following. Sitting on his throne, Hilskaf, with Frigga in the Hall of Valhalla, Odin looked out across the whole world, but he wanted to know everything and gain wisdom and knowledge of things hidden from him. This was a desire that drove him to sacrifice himself. Please excuse my terrible pronunciation there. But based on this passage, it seems to suggest that Odin already had the ability to see into all of the realms. But this wasn't enough for him. He wanted more. Not only did he want to be able to see into all the world, he wanted the knowledge and wisdom of all of the realms. And I think even from this statement, we can already make a connection to Zoro. The idea that Odin already had this great ability to see into all the realms, but this still wasn't enough to satisfy him. I think that could be very much like how Zoro, despite being a very skilled swordsman, that's not enough for him. It's not enough until he becomes the best. It's not enough until he becomes the world's strongest. Kind of like how Odin wants all of the world's knowledge. And if we keep going, it's said that this leads Odin to undertake crazy actions. For example, Odin hangs himself on Yggdrasil for 9 days and 9 nights, starving without food or water, all in order to gain the knowledge of the other worlds, as well as the knowledge to be able to understand the runes. Runes referring to the writing script. And I don't know about you, but for me, this sort of almost symbolic, ritualistic suicide, this paints a very familiar image to the one that we were presented with upon our first introduction to Zoro in the series. Despite being hailed as this great and fearsome pirate hunter, when we first meet him at Shellstown, Zoro is tied up to a pole in the town square, starving with no food or drink. And then most relevant, today's topic about Zoro's missing eye. It's well known that Odin sacrificed his eye at the well of Mimir in the pursuit of knowledge. knowledge. The Well of Mimir, or Mimir's Brunner as per its traditional name, and again my apologies for butchering the pronunciation, this well is said to be beneath one of the 3 roots of Yggdrasil, the world tree which contains much wisdom. And Mimir is actually also one of the Aesir gods, and this god Mimir is known to be the wisest god. And so Odin sought Mimir's knowledge and wisdom, but it's said that when Odin asked Mimir for a drink, Mimir, understanding the value of this spring water, he refused Odin, and he wouldn't offer Odin a drink unless Odin sacrificed or offered an eye in return. And that's exactly what Odin did. He took out his own left eye and he left it in Mimir's well, all so that he could just have a drink from this well of wisdom. And this folktale has been largely interpreted to mean that for those like Odin who share in his value for knowledge and for learning, there is no sacrifice that's too large when it comes to attaining this sort of great wisdom. Now, what sort of wisdom or knowledge Odin exactly acquired isn't known to us, but it's commonly understood that it has something to do with perception, especially given the symbolic meaning of giving up an eye as a sacrifice, where throughout various cultures, throughout time, this idea of the eye or seeing or vision, these are all ways to talk about perception and understanding. So it seems that in this case, Odin has traded one mode of perception for another. And this also seems to specifically relate to the figure of Mimir as well, because Mimir's name can actually be translated to the remembrance or memory. And so in this way, Mimir is apparently the being that taught the other gods to live in accordance with ancient traditions. Mimir seems to be the representation of ancient knowledge, ancient wisdom, this idea of a remembrance or memory of ancient traditions. And so I think that has been interpreted to mean that Odin traded a superficial mode of perception, or in other words, his eyes being a superficial, everyday mode of perception, in order to gain a more sacred mode of perception, one that imbues him with this deep ancestral wisdom and knowledge. And I think this can also be very easily applied to Zoro. When it comes to the recurring theme of sacrifice that's present in Odin, in my opinion, I think this idea is already very much ingrained in Zoro's character. I think we've seen it time and time again. For example, if we go back to his introduction to the series, I think we can interpret those actions in him choosing to hang and starve as sort of a sacrifice for the sake of Rika. We've seen that he's more than willing to sacrifice his own life, and he's willing to sacrifice his dream for the sake of his captain Luffy. We saw that at the end of Thriller Bark. Even when he asks Mihawk to teach him during the time skip, Mihawk comments that Zoro has sacrificed his pride for the sake of Luffy. And then even on a more superficial level, the incredibly intense, his memeable training regime, the grueling training that he puts himself through on a very regular basis, I think even that can be seen as a physical sacrifice, one that he endures all for the purpose of getting stronger, all for the purpose of becoming the best. So then when it comes to the mystery of his left eye, I think we're very likely to see a scenario where Zoro made a great sacrifice, where he sacrificed his eye in order to become a greater, stronger fighter. If Oda decides to stick closer to Norse mythology, we may even see that Zoro traded his eye, again his common mode of perception, to attain a greater sense of perception. And now I don't necessarily mean he had to literally trade his eye in a similar way that Odin did, but I guess a sacrifice, a more symbolic gesture to gain a greater sense of perception. If we think more along the lines of literal combat terms, perception could mean depth perception, for example. Zoro may have a greater understanding of distances, gauging distances during his battles. But if we think in more abstract terms, and I guess a little bit closer to the situation with Odin and Mimir, Zoro could have just gained a more divine and deeper sense of perception. Maybe a divine, deeper understanding of swords and swordsmanship, or a deeper understanding of the ancient tradition of the sword. Especially because if you look at certain translations of chapter 597, Zoro asks Mihawk to teach him the way of the sword. Now admittedly, this isn't actually the line or the dialogue dialogue that the official Viz translation adopts. Here, according to Viz, Zoro just asks Mihawk to teach him what you know. But this is a case where I think I actually like the other translation better. It has greater gravitas, and I think it says more about this idea of swordsmanship, of a swordsman code, the way of the sword. Especially because the way of the sword has been something that Zoro has said on multiple occasions aside from here. And if we're linking it back to our topic today, it fits better with that idea of a perception, a deeper, more divine, and understanding of the ancient tradition of swordsmanship. You know, we may see a scenario where Mihawk made a comment to Zoro that Zoro relies too much on what he can see, and instead he needs to be able to perceive. He needs to be able to perceive and feel and understand his surroundings. And I guess this would actually be sort of a similar learning or similar lesson that Zoro learned himself during his fight against Mr. One in the Arabasta arc. During that battle, we saw Zoro learn how to hear the breath of all things, and that was instrumental in Zoro defeating Bones. And I don't really want to get into the discussion of whether that was Zoro's early manifestation of Haki or not, because I think for the purposes of today's discussion, what is important is that Zoro has already experienced swordsmanship requires a deeper, greater perception, a greater understanding, regardless of whether that's owed to Haki or not. And just as a sidebar, it's kind of funny to think about perception when it comes to Zoro, because if that was the case, if he has truly gained better perception, clearly hasn't improved his sense of perception when it comes to location or places, still terrible at navigation. But anyways, it is also worth noting that in chapter 779, which is really the only scene we have of Zoro's training under Mihawk, Zoro actually still has his left eye unharmed. We can see his full eye, there's no scar, and of course we don't know at what stage during the 2-year time skip this was occurring, but in this moment, Mihawk was teaching Zoro to imbue his swords with Haki, with armament Haki, and so it's possible that Zoro may have just lost his eye while trying to learn how to achieve this feat. And some have argued that since this is really the only definitive or concrete knowledge that we've seen Zoro actually learn from Mihawk, imbuing Haki into his sword is the way of the sword that Zoro was referring to. And I've also seen that people are quite upset about Haki, how Haki seems to be the answer to Zoro's swordsmanship. And again, I think that's a whole other discussion, not really the focus of today's video, but I do want to say that I beg to differ. I don't think that imbuing Haki is all that Zoro has learnt. I think Oda is just saving a greater look into Zoro's training under Mihawk for that final duel with Mihawk. And that's where we're going to see a lot more of the training come out. A lot more flashbacks to show that Zoro is now implementing things that he learned. But I think that for the purposes of today's discussion, if people are already upset about Zoro's big level up being Haki, and that being the great way of the sword that he learned during the time skip, I think by that same logic, Zoro having some sort of almost supernatural ability like a Sharingan eye, that also shouldn't or can't be the answer, especially if we go back to those early concept designs. It seems like Zoro could have ended up with a scar on any part of his head, and Oda wasn't necessarily, or he wasn't originally focusing on Zoro's eye. And so I'm going to take that to mean that it's less likely that Zoro's eye is closed because he's secretly housing some special ability. Also because since the time skip, we have seen, or there have been opponents against whom Zoro has really struggled, or at least there has been King the Lunarian being the main one that Zoro has really struggled with. And if Zoro had a trick up his sleeve like a crazy eye power, I feel like Wano was the time that he should have broken it out. You know, those were some pretty dire times. He was really struggling against King. Now, obviously, this isn't all to say that it's impossible that Zoro is hiding some sort of secret ability. This is One Piece at the end of the day. You can never say never. And look, I think it would even be pretty fun to see him have some sort of crazy Sharingan ability. You know, in a this is wild, this is crazy, unbelievable kind of way. But I have to say that personally for me, I prefer something a little more grounded. I prefer the idea that Zoro traded his left eye, or that he sacrificed his eye. He sacrificed his common mode of perception, all for the sake of gaining a greater sense of perception, all for the sake of gaining some something that will make him a truer, better swordsman, a better, stronger swordsman who truly understands the way of the sword. As always, with historical or mythological, any sort of real-life inspirations, I don't think Oda has taken Odin's character one for one, but there are some other similarities between Odin and Zoro that I think you may be interested in. Apparently, Odin is also often portrayed as a charming man who enjoys drinking mead and wine, and I found that quite fun because obviously that's a clear likeness to Zoro, who also has shown his love for drinking on many occasions. And we also know that Zoro is also charming in his own way. You know, from the beginning of the series, we've seen that he is able to amass his own followers. Odin was also known as the Wanderer, often depicted as traveling, whether that be on his quests to gain knowledge or whether that be to oversee events that's occurring throughout the world. And when Odin is described on his travels, often readers aren't explicitly told that this is Odin. It seems that the tales just speak of an old man with only one eye, wearing a coat or a cloak, and wearing a wide-brimmed hat, carrying a spear. And we're just supposed to be able to tell from this description that this is Odin. And I thought it was interesting to find out about Odin's association with a wide-brimmed hat. Obviously, because this seems to be more like Luffy, who has his own wide-brimmed hat, his own wide-brimmed straw hat. But like I said, these interpretations, these inspirations are never taken one for one, and it's possible that maybe given Odin's importance to Norse mythology, again he's the head god, maybe Oda's interest in Norse tales overall meant that he was also inspired by Odin and his wide-brimmed hat when creating the straw hat. But if we go back to this image of a man traveling on his lonesome, going about his solo adventures, I think that is a very fitting image for Zoro. We often see Zoro get up to his own solo quests within an arc. We witnessed this very recently at the beginning of Wano, for example, but it's also how I like to imagine Zoro's future self at the end of the series or during the epilogue. I can very much imagine Zoro as an old man wandering about from place to place, being very distinguishable by his one eye as well as the great sword or his great three swords that he carries. It also feels very Rayleigh-esque, which I think is also fitting because Zoro and Rayleigh are the right-hand men of their respective captains. But this image of a wandering one-eyed man, that also led me down another thought train. Given One Piece is a pirate manga, many fans have long been wondering why the series doesn't feature a pirate wearing the classic pirate eye patch, especially because that eye patch has become almost synonymous with piracy in modern day depictions. And in response, Oda actually said all the way back in 2007 that by the end of the series there will be a character who does wear the classic eye patch. And actually the translation from Oda says, "A pirate with an eye patch will appear in the final phase of One Piece. I'm itching to draw that character as soon as possible." And based on these words, it feels to me that Oda is actually talking about a new character who's going to make their appearance in the final saga. A pirate whose eye patch is going to be a focal part of his or her design. And given that we now know that Joy Boy was the world's first pirate, and we are now in the final saga, but we haven't actually seen Joy Boy's full appearance yet, I think it would be most fitting to give Joy Boy the eye patch, you know, the OG pirate wearing the pirate's eye patch. But Oda's comment is pretty vague, and so it is possible that he was just saying that there is going to be an eye patch at some point in the series. We're going to see it by the end of the series, and in that case, that could still be Zoro. Especially because if we again go back to the concept designs, it seems like that one of these designs almost looks like Zoro is wearing an eye patch. And so I have imagined if we get some sort of epilogue, maybe we could potentially see Zoro become the wandering old man, much like Odin, but this is going to be an old Zoro wearing an eye patch, following his terrible sense of direction to just go to all sorts of different places that aren't necessarily where he initially intended to go. And I rather like this image of Zoro, especially because he started out the series as a pirate hunter, but if he ends up with an eye patch, that means by the end of the series, he's going to be wearing the most iconic piece of clothing or the most iconic piece of attire that has been associated with piracy. But with all said and done, I still do think that Joy Boy is probably the most likely candidate to be wearing the eye patch. Anyways, I just found it really cool to learn about Odin, and as soon as I came across this tale of how he lost his eye, that immediately made me think of Zoro and his left eye, and I was really excited to share this all with you. So let me know what you guys think about Zoro and his eye and his scar by leaving a comment below. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon. One Piece is hitting all the right spots right now. I mean, my god, Oda, what are you doing to me? Those of you who know me know that I am an absolute history nerd. I especially love ancient history. I also love ancient mythology, and Elbaf is just tickling me silly with all of these allusions to all of these ancient cultures, all of these ancient mythologies. I've honestly been on such a high just listening to so much and reading up on so many of these ancient myths and folk tales, and the revelations in chapter 1128 were no different. It sent me off to research all of the different types of solar deities in ancient traditions, and I have to say, I think we may be onto something here. And I hope you guys are enjoying this history and these mythological deep dives as much as I am, or at least I hope that my enthusiasm is rubbing off on you, because it seems like Elbaf, and you know what, actually scratch that, it seems like the rest of the series is going to be chock-a-block full of references to historical myths and real-life mythological allusions, so you need to get on board, and you need to get on board fast. But I do think today's ramblings will interest you, because I think that I now understand what might be the connection between all of the D-Clan members, or at least all of Joy Boy's allies, and it has to do with the sun god. And we're going to discuss all of that together, all of these connections. But you know what? Before we do, there's another connection that is very important, and that's the connection between you and I. And do you know what connects all of us together? It's our shared love for One Piece, and it's our shared love for clicking the subscribe button. Please subscribe to my video so that you and I can be bonded, a very special bond for the love of One Piece, a sacred bond that also means you get to hear more of my One Piece discussions, because who doesn't want more of that? Okay, so chapter 1128 reveals the existence of an actual sun god deity in Elbaf, which was somewhat surprising and somewhat not. Mainly because we have always known that Elbaf does revere and worship sun deities in some way or another. This isn't new, we knew it all the way back from Big Mom's flashback when we saw that the Elbafians observed the winter solstice, so we knew that there was some sort of festival, a celebration of the sun. And then of course in Egghead Island this was further expanded upon. When Dory and Brogy first arrive at Egghead Island, they recognize Luffy as sun god Nika, and even in Vegapunk's message, Vegapunk refers to Nika as the sun god spoken of in Elbaf legend. And I think that meant we all assumed that Elbaf had knowledge of and even worshipped sun god Nika. Or at least I assumed. I assumed that Elbafians knew of sun god Nika and worshipped sun god Nika. Whereas now, it seems like Elbafians have a sun god of their own, a distinct sun god that is separate from sun god Nika. And that seems to be paradoxical, right? I mean, we've got two paradoxical facts here. One is the fact that they definitely do know of sun god Nika. That's based off Dory and Brogy's dialogue as well as Vegapunk's message. But here we now also know they have their own separate sun god. So I was really pondering about this since reading chapter 1128. And the logical conclusion that I came away with is that Elbafians, much like ancient traditions or ancient peoples and civilizations that existed in our real world. Ancient civilizations who had paganistic religions, polytheistic religions, meaning they worshipped more than one god. In a lot of ancient cultures, people believed in multiple iterations, multiple versions of solar-based deities. But what was really interesting to find out was that more so than this being a common feature of Norse culture and Norse mythology, which of course is is the most obvious place to look to first because Elbaf seems to be otherwise very heavily inspired by Nordic culture. But this existence and this belief in multiple sun gods is actually characteristic of other cultures and other religions. And probably the most notable that I came across was ancient Egyptian religion. So I got stuck down a whole rabbit hole of researching different Egyptian gods, different Egyptian sun gods, and then I had to stop myself because, Egypt is the basis for Arabasta and not for Elbaf. And then I had a bit of an aha moment where I went, hang on, maybe this is all connected. So to borrow words from Usopp from chapter 1128, this is where I'm at. What if all of Joy Boy's allies, what if all of Joy Boy's followers are connected through their shared belief in a sun god? Now that we know Elbafians actually definitely have a sun god of their own, and that sun god seems to be a pretty important deity to Elbafians as well. I mean, look at how much the citizens revere the sun god in chapter 1128, although maybe you can't actually take the worship and the reverence of these characters from chapter 1128 from face value, because they seem to, I don't know, I guess you could say that they actually have a case of Stockholm syndrome, because they all seem to be unwittingly captive of this false RPG world that the sun god has created. But even aside from these characters in chapter 1128, like I said, we've seen before that every year the Elbafians observe the winter solstice. They celebrate the sun, they worship a sun deity. And then this got me thinking, because this isn't the first time, or this isn't the only time where we've seen references to a sun god that doesn't necessarily, or hasn't necessarily been confirmed to be about Nika. And the one that I'm talking about is back from the Skypiea arc. Remember back in Skypiea, the Shandorians, they also worshipped a sun god, albeit it was alongside some other gods like the rain god and the earth god and the forest god, but the priest prayed to the sun god first, almost as if the sun god is the most important. And it would be remiss of me not to mention the fact that the Shandorians also seem to be a civilization that exists in One Piece that seems to be heavily inspired by a real-life ancient civilization. It seems like the Shandorians were very much influenced by the Mayan civilization, and the Mayans also had their own pagan religion featuring their own solar deity. Not to mention the fact that it was also back in the Skypiea arc where we saw Luffy doing that classic Joy Boy Give 5 Nika dance. So then I started thinking about all the other races, all the other special families that we have, especially those connected to Joy Boy. And this made me think of Arabasta first because, again, I told you I went down a deep rabbit hole looking at Egyptian culture, and I thought, what's to say that Arabasta don't have their own solar deity, especially when you consider the huge significance of sun gods in Egypt? Like I said, in comparison to Norse mythology, Egypt actually has multiple sun gods, and sun gods also seem to be a lot more important in Egypt because the sun god seems to be the head of the gods. They're the heads of the pantheon. For example, the sun god Re or Ra was considered the head god of the Egyptian pantheon, and Ra has also taken on multiple iterations throughout the ages. It seems to be a common quirk in Egyptian religion that gods would somehow take on different qualities or would be merged with other gods. Their names change throughout history, and so this sun god in Egypt plays much more of a significant role than the sun goddess of Norse culture, Sol, plays in Norse culture. So then I was thinking maybe this means we're going to see a sun god in Arabasta, or you could even argue that we have through the Nefertari family itself because of the meaning of Nefertari. So this name, Nefertari, actually exists in our real life history. Nefertari is the name of a very famous Egyptian queen. Queen Nefertari was the wife of Ramses II, and Ramses literally means born of Ra or born of Re. And again, Re or Ra is the sun god, the principal sun god. So if you think about it, you could say that we actually do have a manifestation or a representation of a sun god in Arabasta already through the royal family. Especially when you consider how religion seems to work in the Arabasta kingdom. The title of god seems to be bestowed upon those who have connections to the royal family. For example, Pel and Chakra were called the guardian gods. Pel and and chakra seems to be heavily influenced by Egyptian deities. Hell's falcon form in particular actually could be related to Horus, the falcon god of the sky according to Egyptian legend. And as I mentioned before, because of different gods merging in different points in history, this god Horus is actually known to be connected to the god Re or Ra, and Ra and Horus were merged to form a super god called Re Horakti. So then I started thinking about it, and we've got a sun god in Elbaf, we have a sun god in Chandoria, and a representation of a sun god in Arabasta. So why stop there? Why not think about all the other special races? Which led me to think about the Fishmen as another one of the major allies of Joy Boy. And again at Fishmen, similar to Arabasta, we have a case where those of the royal family seem to be connected to deities in our real life, especially deities of the sea, which makes sense because the Fishmen are an underwater civilization. So we've got King Neptune, and Neptune is the name of the Roman god of the sea, whereas Otohime seems to be the name of the daughter of the Japanese sea god called Ryujin. And then of course Shirahoshi, who is also known as Poseidon, or the physical manifestation of Poseidon, and Poseidon is the Greek god of the sea. So that's the sea gods. How about the sun? Well, although it doesn't seem like we have a sun god per se in Fishman Island, the sun is still obviously a very central theme for the Fishmen. The main storyline that concerns the Fishmen is their desire, is their wish to live on the surface so that they can get direct sunlight. You know, one of the most notable crew to emerge from the Fishmen are the Sun Pirates, and then all of the other pirate crews that have emerged from Fishmen are somehow related to the Sun Pirates. Sun obviously being the key word there. And you could even argue that Sunlight Tree Eve almost plays a deity-like element. Maybe you think I'm stretching it too far, but of course I'm not actually saying Sunlight Tree Eve is like a god itself, but it's a tree that has very significant meaning for the Fishmen. You know, it's something they rely on, it's something they depend on, it's something that they're very grateful towards. It's even said that this underwater civilization can survive through the light that emanates through the Sunlight Tree Eve. So even if it's not technically a deity, you could say that it plays like a super important role in their lives, almost like a religion. And what I'm getting at is that the sun and this idea of sun gods, sun deities, this could be the link. You know, maybe we're gonna find out that belief in a solar deity or belief in solar deities plural, this belief is a common feature in special groups, special races, special species, and in particular the ones that have a special connection to Joy Boy. You know, this could have been the foundation that made people follow Joy Boy, especially when Joy Boy became a sun god in his own right, when he became sun god Nika. This could have been what made his allies believe in him. I mean, can you imagine if this is what caused Nefertari Lily to betray the other 20 kingdoms to side with Joy Boy instead? You know, maybe she felt that by siding with Joy Boy, she was doing the work of God. She's doing the work of the sun god. And then I started thinking, maybe this isn't even limited to just the followers or allies of Joy Boy. Maybe this is what connects all the D-Clan members. Maybe there's a reason why Blackbeard or people from Blackbeard's race can't sleep at night. It has something to do with the sun. Maybe it's a relationship between Blackbeard's race and the sun god. Maybe they were cursed by the sun god, for example. Maybe they defied the sun god at some point. Or let's take the Monkey D family, for example. Fans have long pointed out that the Monkey King, which is a religious figure from a popular Chinese novel from the 16th century, a novel called Journey to the West. Fans have long pointed out that this Monkey King seems to have inspired Oda greatly in developing Luffy's character, and it just so happens that this Monkey King is named Sun Wukong. So that's another connection between the D-Clan and the Sun for you. And look, I haven't found connections for all the D-Clan members yet, but if we look at Clover, which is the latest person person to be a confirmed D clan member. Cleave D Clover, Cloudy Clover, Cloud Clover, whichever way you choose to pronounce his name, doesn't matter. Either way, Clover's character seems to be heavily inspired by Irish culture and traditions, and we know that given Irish are traditionally Celtic, it just so happens that there is also a Celtic sun god. The Celtic sun god's name is Luke. I'm sorry if I've mispronounced that, but Luke happens to be one of the most beloved heroes in Irish folktale or in Celtic folklore. And what was really interesting was that Celtic folklore also features a deity who has antlers. So this deity is named Sonunos, and again, I'm really sorry for mispronouncing everything in this discussion. And while this god isn't directly related to the sun, it does seem like he embodies strong connections to nature, fertility, animals, and life force. And so I guess you could argue that this means that he is symbolically linked to the idea of sun's life-giving properties. And I just bring this up because Sonunos was the first god that came up when I tried searching up a sun god who also has antlers. Obviously because of the antlers and the sun god figure that we saw in chapter 1128. Anyways, like I said, I haven't been able to come up with connections for all the D clan members yet. So if you know more, for example, if you have connections between Goldie Roger to the sun or Portgas and so on and so forth, please do let me know. But in the meantime, a more general connection that I suppose could relate to all the D clan members could be the shape of the D itself. You know, rather than the D standing for a word, it could just be a symbol. Because obviously the D looks like half a circle, so you could say that the D looks like half a sun. Or more specifically, if you rotate the D 90 degrees to the left, I think I got that mathematically correct. If you rotate it, you could argue that the D looks like the sun, or like a sunrise that's appearing over the horizon. Or you could even say that it represents the sun setting, and the sunrise could represent members of the D clan like Luffy, like Roger, whereas the sunset could represent the darker forces of the D clan like Blackbeard or like Roxy Zebek. And that's also very interesting because in a lot of ancient cultures, in a lot of ancient mythologies, there does seem to be a lot of stuff that has to do with the different stages of the sun. There's a lot of meaning about the sun setting versus the sun rising, about the, the sun dying or the solar cycle, and this could all be represented through the different types of D clan members. Anyways, if we're right about this, or if we're at least on the right track, then I think this is very interesting because it sheds a whole new light, or it recontextualizes the entire idea of the D clan being the enemy of the gods. That statement would actually be totally wrong. It would be totally ironic because rather than the D clan being the enemy of the gods, they're actually the believer of the gods. They're the believers of the true god, because the celestial dragons are false gods and the D clan members are manifestations or are representations and deeply connected to sun gods. So then going down this thought train also started making me wonder, if there are multiple sun gods that exist in the One Piece world, why is sun god Nika so special? What makes Nika so important? Especially because it even seems like the world government may excuse people's belief in a sun god so long as it's not sun god Nika. I mean, for example, Elbaf hasn't come under the attack by the world government yet, or as far as we know, and to be fair, I guess you could argue that the world government would be way too scared to try and attack Warland Elbaf, the Elbaf that is affiliated with Shanks, the Elbaf that is the home to warrior giants. But let's even take the God's Knight figure, for example. Now, I do want to premise this discussion with the full disclaimer that everything that I'm going to say now is obviously unconfirmed, or unconfirmed at this point. But I'm sure we've all noticed that the mask that the figure in chapter 1128 is wearing seems awfully similar to the one that the God's Knight was wearing during Kuma's flashback. And obviously this raises some questions. Now the first question is actually whether both these figures are actually wearing a mask and this isn't actually just their heads. But let's just assume that they are because that's what it seems seems like. And if we also assume that the masks are the same, you'd have to wonder, why is that god's knight wearing that mask? You know, does he know of the sun god? Does he revere the sun god of Elbaf? You know, maybe that mask is supposed to be somewhat like a good luck charm, some sort of religious talisman. You know, similar to how people of the Catholic religion carry around rosary beads, for example. Especially as a knight or a warrior. It could be a religious talisman that they keep in the belief it's going to keep them safe and it's going to give them strength, because that's quite common across cultures. For example, even if you look at Viking culture also being a very combat heavy culture similar to the God's Knights, or sort of similar to the God's Knights, many Vikings used to wear Thor's hammer as a pendant, sort of as a prayer, sort of as a mark or a symbol to keep them safe, to give them strength. So maybe that's what we were seeing there with the God's Knight wearing the mask of the sun god of Elbaf as a sign of respect, as a means of prayer, asking the sun god to give him strength and to keep him safe, given he is a God's Knight member, therefore a warrior, therefore someone who has to fight a lot. Which then goes back to my original question of why would the world government allow the God's Knight member to wear a symbol of a sun god? Is it because the world government only outlaws sun god Nika? And is that because sun god Nika was the head of all the gods? Is sun god Nika the head of all the sun gods? Similar to, like I said, going back to ancient Egypt, Amun-Ra or Mun-Re was considered the head god of all the deities, including all the sun god deities. You know, maybe it was sun god Nika who had the most power. Maybe he could spur all the other gods into action. Maybe sun god Nika is able to bestow special abilities on other people, bestow special abilities on other gods, which is similar, or which is what seemed like was happening between Luffy and Bonnie. And I do have a whole video discussing that very topic about Nika, about how Nika seems to be able to grant people special abilities, and that this is why the world government decided to persecute the Buccaneers so heavily for their belief in Nika. And I highly recommend you to go watch that video if you haven't already. But for the purposes of today's discussion, now I think I might have spiraled a little bit too deep here, so let's bring this back a little bit. Because I guess an easier answer, I guess a more straightforward thought train would be that both these figures, both the Sun God and the God's Knight member, these masks aren't necessarily a symbol of the sun god. They could just be a symbol of strength. You know, maybe it doesn't have to relate to the gods or to the sun god specifically. They've both just chosen these antlered masks because antlers also have a very specific meaning. In many cultures in our real world, antlers have a huge symbolic role. Across the various cultures, it actually seems to have a very similar meaning. Antlers seem to mean the cycle of life. It means an untamed, wild nature. And I guess even then you could argue that those are almost metaphors for divinity and metaphors for gods, because gods are typically the source of life in religion. You know, they give life to humans, they control the lives of humans and of all other creatures. And you could also argue that gods are untamed, they're uncontrollable, they're wild, because they obviously can't be tamed. They can't be tamed by humans because they stand above us. So then I started looking more at stags and antlers, and in particular their connection or their meaning in Norse mythology. And although I couldn't find any stag gods or any deer gods per se, I did definitely find that stags do play a very important role in Norse mythology. And so the two most relevant I found is first the Echthenir. Look, again, so sorry, but Echthenir is the name of a stag in Norse mythology, and this stag is said to stand on the roof of Valhalla. And Valhalla is the Great Hall. It's one of the realms where Odin receives fallen warriors, and this stag's antlers are said to drip water, and this water is said to flow into the well called Helmigir, and this well feeds into all the rivers of the world. And in this way, this symbolizes that this stag and the stag's antlers have life-giving properties. It's supposed to represent the natural cycles of the cosmos. It's supposed to represent fertility and the cycle of life or the flow of life. The other important stag is actually a group of 4 stags, and you know what? I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce their names. But this group of stags, they're said to live in the branches of Yggdrasil, the world tree, and these stags are supposed to symbolize the connection between the natural world and the cosmos because they live in the branches of Yggdrasil, and Yggdrasil is supposed to represent the axis of the universe. So again, these stags also represent vitality, nature, the cycle of life, and their antlers are supposed to connect them to the tree's divine energy. Meaning that in both these two examples, stags and antlers seem to represent life and divinity, which is what I was saying, that stags seem to be, in a roundabout way, represent the nature of gods. And so I guess in that sense, it does make sense as to why Oda would have chosen to give this Elbathian sun god antlers. In both of these examples, these stags of Norse mythology, they seem to stand at the precipice, at the margins, or the border. They stand at the border of the different realms that exist in Norse mythology. In the first example, the stag stands at the border, at the gate of Valhalla. And in the second example, these stags are supposed to symbolize the connection between the natural world and the cosmos. The stags represent the gateway between worlds, or between realms, which is very fitting because in chapter 1128 we were introduced to this idea of the separate realms. You know, we have the real world where the giants actually seem to live, and then we have this fake Lego world, and it seems that this sun god of Elbath, he seems to control who goes in and who goes out. So again, very fitting, very interesting, and this is where my head's been at, but I'd love to know what you think, especially about my sun god idea. What do you think about the existence of multiple sun gods, a sun god existing for each of Joy Boy's allies, potentially each of the D clan members? If you know of any further connections between the D clan and real life mythology, especially for the ones that I haven't been able to come up with connections for yet, let me know by leaving a comment below. Or even if you were thinking about this Elbathian sun god from a completely different perspective, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the idea, so let me know in a comment below. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon. The ending of One Piece is something we already know because Oda has been hinting at this from the beginning, from the very first chapter, Romance Dawn, and the recent reveal of Gear 5th pretty much confirms this. The fact that there are a lot of different sources of inspiration that has influenced Oda's work is not a surprise. The series is jam-packed with allusions to ancient mythology, famous artworks, kids programs, religious symbols, and so much more. But something that's been widely missed in our reading of One Piece is the fact that the entire series is a fictionalized account of our real-world history. A brilliantly fantastical and imaginative retelling where One Piece is a reflection of key moments of human civilization. And that is how and why we already know the ending of One Piece. Although there aren't many explicit references to dates in the series, those we have seen provide a pretty clear picture of when the current storyline is taking place in history. For example, through the exploration of Mont Blanc Nolan's journey, whose exploration landed him in Jaya in the year 1122, we know that the events of current day One Piece is taking place in around the 1500s because we were told that Nolan's adventures took place approximately 400 years in the past. And from Nolan's logbook, we know that one of the calendar systems that is used in the One Piece world, and the one that Nolan was using, is that of the Age of the Sea Circle, which for all intents and purposes seems to match our real-world Gregorian calendar in terms of months and dates. Which is to say that it's almost as if One Piece is taking place in the 16th century of our real world, albeit in an alternate universe where people have supernatural powers by eating unappetizing fruit, and where humanoid species such as fishmen and giants exist. And now of course this won't be an exact one-to-one, century-to-century comparison, and different islands do seem to be stuck in different time periods, such as Little Garden, which is still home to dinosaurs, placing them in the Jurassic Age, and in terms of technology where characters use flintlocks and muskets, which didn't really come about until the 1800s in our real world, or even the widespread existence of telephones, albeit snail-based telephones, it seems the One Piece world is much more advanced than we were in the 1500s. And of course, who could forget the mind-blowing reveal that the ancient kingdom that existed almost a millennia ago had such advanced technology that even Dr. Vegapunk struggles to achieve. But this also seems to be quite like our real world, where different species on different continents advanced at different speeds. And similar to our real world generally having a Eurocentric view of history, Oda seems to have provided a timeline and calendar which is comparable to the European world, thereby placing the world of One Piece in the 16th century. And this also checks out when we consider what was going on in our real world during the 16th century, particularly in the world of pirates. Piracy was rampant in the 1500s and peaked in the 1600s, which has become the era known as the Golden Age of Piracy, the same exact term used in One Piece to describe the era that Goldie Roger set aflame. And the reason why this is significant is because the history of our world and that of One Piece lines up much more than we realize. And so this may reveal where the story is taking us in the future. We know that the One Piece world dates back to at least 5,000 years ago, because the Tree of Knowledge is said to have been planted around that time. So the fact that the Age of Sea Circle doesn't go back this far may indicate that, similar to the real world where we have historical period BC and AD, there may be a period in One Piece that categorizes events which took place prior to the beginning of the Age of Sea Circle. Perhaps this is the Age of Heaven that Robin alluded to in the Arabasta arc. Either way, what's important is that we know from at least 1100 up to 900 years ago, there were great civilizations in the One Piece world that were thriving. This is clear from Shandora, the City of Gold, which we know to have prospered in the year 402, and the Great Ancient Kingdom, which flourished before the events of the Void Century 900 years ago. And it just so happens that this lines up with the classical age of our real-world history, spanning an extremely long period from 800 BC to late 400 AD. Human society witnessed the apex of great civilizations such as the Babylonians, ancient Greece, and the Roman Empire. These civilizations are heralded for their advanced scientific knowledge, philosophy, and technology, and we use many of their inventions and developments still today, including maps, roads, central heating, and even flushing toilets. And this bears close resemblance with recent reveals in One Piece. Vegapunk suggests the ancient kingdom to have been an incredibly technologically advanced society with astounding scientific knowledge. Knowledge that surpasses even that of the genius scientists, evidenced by the futuristic yet simultaneously ancient Iron Giant. So it seems like Oda has drawn very clear links between the ancient kingdom and potentially its allies and the ancient civilizations of our real world. It's surely no coincidence that the ancient weapons are all named after deities from ancient Greco-Roman mythology. But much like the real world, where the period of classical antiquity was followed by the period of Dark Ages, the One Piece world with its own advanced civilizations were plunged into the Void Century. In real-life history, the Dark Ages, or the Middle Ages as it's also known, came about due to the fall of the Roman Empire, which is caused by civil war and political unrest, as well as external attacks from other tribes. And this may be what happened in the One Piece world. Although we know for sure that the 20 kingdoms who would later go on to form the world government opposed the Great Kingdom, it's also been suggested that there may have been other deeper politics at play, from Zunisha's yet-to-be-revealed traitorous action to the relationship between the Nefertari Kingdom to the rest of the D clan. It seems like there's more to the Great War than just the other kingdoms being jealous over the ancient kingdom's power and influence. And while that may be just speculation, in any case, the Void Century is a very clear reflection of the Dark Ages, a period in real-world history where previously advanced technology and knowledge was lost. In One Piece, the world has been seemingly forced into a state of darkness. All knowledge and the technology of the previously glorious era is kept secret by the world government, which brings us to the period just before the current timeline to the present, where it seems like much of the recent events of the One Piece world, spanning from around the period of Rocksteady Zebek to Goldie Roger, is a reflection of the Renaissance. The Renaissance, meaning rebirth, spanned from the 15th to 17th century. It was a period in our history marked by new knowledge and discoveries in terms of science and exploration, and an effort to revive the ideas and achievements of the classical era. And this period seems to be heavily represented in One Piece, where figures like Zebek or the Ohara scholars were determined to unearth the lost secrets of the Void Century, or the grand adventures embarked by the late Pirate King resulting in finding a new island Laugh Tale, very much resembling the exploration and discovery of new lands in our real world during this time. And in this light, the world government also seems to be a reflection of a real-life institution that existed during this period, the Catholic Church. Okay, I know you might be wondering, how does this all link to the ending of One Piece? But bear with me. In our history, as ideas flourished, the power and the influence of the Catholic Church diminished, which up to this point was the almighty authority in the European world. And perhaps the greatest example of the relevance of all of this to One Piece is the case of Galileo Galilei, an Italian astronomer who expanded on previous studies by other Renaissance astronomers to champion the heliocentric model of our solar system. Up to this point, humans had believed in the geocentric model, which claimed that the Earth was the center of our universe. The Church opposed the heliocentric model, which theorized that the Sun was the center of a solar system, and went as far as to persecute Galileo, who later died in house arrest. And now, why is this relevant? Because this is the story of One Piece. The parallels between the world government and the old Catholic Church are clear, both being the authoritative institutions of their respective worlds, and right down to the aesthetic choices that Oda has made in designing the world government. The architecture of Marijoi's Pangaea Castle closely resembles the Vatican Palace, and the empty throne is shaped like St. Peter's Square. And the existence of the Holy Knights in One Piece adds yet another real-life touch, as Oda was likely inspired by the knights that served as a military order for the Catholic Church. And with the recent name reveals of all the Gorosei as having a clear planetary theme, it's also fitting that there are only 5 Gorosei members, because during this period in history, we had only discovered 5 planets. It wouldn't be until after the 1700s that we would discover Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto, which are the names of the 3 planets that haven't been assigned to a Gorosei, and just so happens to be the names of the ancient weapons. Meaning that much like the geocentric model advocated by the Catholic Church, Imu surrounds themselves with the planetary elder stars. So what does this all mean? One Piece is the story of our world moving from a geocentric model to realizing the truth of the heliocentric model. And the reveal of Gear 5th, with Luffy having the Nika Devil Fruit, making him the Sun God, is a clear indication of this. Whereas currently, the world places the world government with the world nobles, and for those who know, Imu at its center and head, Luffy is the representation of the sun as Sun God Nika, who will set the world free. And as much as the church in our real world try to stop this movement, going to great lengths to preserve their order and authority, so too is Imu and the world government doing all that it can to ensure that the light of Joy Boy does not shine. But it doesn't end here, because as much as the Renaissance marked the transition away from the Middle Ages to the modern era, this period, which is usually associated with art and culture, was also wrought with revolutions and civil war. The late Renaissance to the early modern age was an ugly period which saw much conflict and conquest, filled with wars and bloodshed. And again, this is present in One Piece, where both pirates and the world government wreak havoc and violence across the kingdoms and villages. More recently, we've witnessed revolutions take place where citizens of kingdoms like Lulusia have deposed their royal leaders. And in this way, Luffy, as the representative of the sun, has much more meaning than just representing the heliocentric model, because Luffy is the bringer of the dawn, and not just any dawn, but Romance Dawn. And while we have come to know this term Romance Dawn to mean the start of Luffy's romanticized adventure, the emotions of excitement, mystery, and a pure love for the journey ahead, Oda seems to have very clearly hidden a core period of history in the series yet again. Because in the real world, we've also seen a period of romanticism, marking the 18th century following the early modern era, and shortly after the world-defining French Revolution. Romanticism was an artistic and cultural movement that swept through Europe. It pushed back on the ugliness and darkness of the rational early modern era, and featured aesthetics focused on beauty and the sublime. It dared to hope and consider possibilities rather than just facing harsh realities. In fact, romanticism is often defined according to 5 elements: imagination, intuition, individuality, idealism, and inspiration. Words that all perfectly embody Luffy. From the very first arc, the very first chapter of the series, Oda marked Luffy as the figure of Romance Dawn, as the figure of romanticism, an intuitive figure that provokes the world to imagine, hold on to their ideals, respect individuals' rights and freedoms, and inspire hope for for the future. One Piece is a story about Luffy's journey to become Pirate King, but it's also a story about our human society, how we've developed and backtracked, plunged into darkness, how we've fought, and how we've been reborn to learn new truths and dare for better and brighter worlds. Because ultimately, how One Piece ends is about hope and possibilities, about imagining our future of ideals and inspiration, of the dawn of romance. Let me know what you think by leaving a comment below. If you liked this video, please do subscribe. Thank you to all of our Patreon and channel members, and thanks to everyone for listening to another one of my rambling thoughts. This is JoyGirl, and I'll see you again soon.